Perfecting and Reforming Personal Religion, Chapter 1, which is entitled Practical Living Through Self-Regulation. And this brief chapter, which is 9 paragraphs long, really touches on an important point that carries throughout the entire book, the point of self-regulation through abstinence, exercising abstinence on what we would normally use for stimulating our religious conversation. So abstinence from stimulants, theological, philosophical theories, thoughts or opinions, preferences, beliefs that we take and that we use to stimulate our confidence in what we believe. So the goal is to not be stimulated by anything artificial. What is artificial? What is artificial is something that comes from outside of your experience, out of your living experience. What is artificial is something that we have taken in without any sort of validity or proof necessary. It's simply taken in because it matches with what we already believe. It matches with a pre-existing understanding of what we already believe. And due to that pre-existing understanding, we believe that there can be no error in it, and so it is held dearly. It is held close to an already existing belief. But what should really be going on is the challenging of our faith's intellect for the purpose of owning our personal devotional conversation above having it dictated to us through either belief in traditional thought or on belief in the pre-existing understanding that we have, or on the self-cultivated feelings on what we believe we think we know. And so this chapter, Practical Living Through Self-Regulation, one of the points that it makes is a refraining from or abstinence from the theories and the philosophy that is traditionally passed down and that we take to be sure. Being abstinent from these things, it gives us an opportunity to investigate not just them, but also our own self in relation to them. And as we're doing so, we can then take that experience, match it with whatever we are curious about within the words that the Bible has, and we can gain knowledge from that. That knowledge is important. That knowledge is for the practical living aspect of this chapter's title. So we're regulating the self of our personal religious conversation so that we can maintain a practical devotional habit. A habit of devotion that transcends what is religion. A devotional practice that transcends everything to the point where it becomes basic living philosophy. And so this chapter is calling for a resemblance of the faith demonstrated by Paul, Peter, John, and them boys. And the philosophy that they taught was one where knowledge through a living experience on the living God's will and wisdom is what defines the conversation. And a bit of an introduction into this is mentioned in this chapter, which briefly talks about 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 56, where the definition of sin is in reference to the philosophy of the religious law. And this chapter then connects that to the point where what really took place on that crucifixion, it initiated a concept where not simply the philosophy of Moses, the ancient Moses, was replaced with a more profound inward experience, but the philosophy of every other individual that we would perceive to be a Moses is also annihilated. Meaning, as the Bible says in Ephesians chapter 1, those last 5, 6, 7 verses. Our experience is to be personal and is not supposed to be regulated by the pen or the mind of priest or minister, past or present. The transaction that's supposed to happen is to occur within. Anything getting in the way of that is a stimulant, causing our experience to become delusional in a sense, taking us away from the human and devotional development that we are supposed to experience. Not going to, explain much, because this chapter is simply just an introduction to the book, being the first chapter after the introduction. But in addition to regulating the conversation's conscience, abstaining from what is accredited theologically, bringing that experience inwardly and gaining knowledge from it to practically maintain a devotional life. This chapter introduces the subject of sin, and sin from the perspective of the Bible, not sin from the perspective of what is traditionally taught to be sin. Sin, in the traditional sense, is secular. Sin, in the sense of the Bible, is strictly devotional. To the Bible, to the mind of the Bible, the definition of sin is the philosophy of the religious law. What is the philosophy of the religious law? The philosophy of the religious law, as it states in Galatians chapter 5, verse 4, I believe, is that, quote unquote, you are justified by the religious law, meaning that what is handwritten, past or present, is what claims you and certifies you as a son or a daughter of God. Nothing else is needed. There's nothing else that is required. All it is required is for you to obey what is handwritten and to put into perspective what is handwritten with your experience, fulfilling whatever rite, whatever baptism, believing on whatever theory, trusting on whatever doctrine, and obeying whatever priest or minister in order to claim that both you and your conversation is beautiful, righteous, pious, desirable, favorable to a divine eye. This is the philosophy of the religious law. And to the mind of the Bible, the philosophy of the religious law is the definition of sin, which is what 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 56 states. So what this chapter is doing is introducing you to the definition of sin and how to combat that. Other chapters will explain more in depth how this conclusion of sin that the Bible makes is determined. But for this first chapter, a little bit of principles on how to perfect and reform your personal religion is given. And so, abstinence from what naturally stimulates your belief, theologically, externally, a turning to what can highlight the beauty of your experience internally, meaning that from that abstinence, you have no other source but the words. There is no other source but the words. Turning to those words, limiting yourself from the opinions and perceptions from outside of those words, turning to those words to gain knowledge to practically regulate your devotional mind. And then understanding the definition of sin. The definition of sin that every time our conversation, would submit to a specific religious idea or law or commandment or rite or ritual, that we are committing a crime against the experience that the mind of the Bible would have our conversation pass through. That's why it is called sin. By using a mediator or an instrument to dictate to us our devotional behavior, we are committing a crime against the mind within the Bible, and we are committing a crime against our own personal devotional mind. So the Bible wants to eliminate that crime. The philosophy within the Bible wants to eliminate that crime by giving the reins of the conversation to us and to the words within the Bible itself. And that's the foundation behind practical living through self-regulation. By regulating the devotional mind, a practical philosophy to live by is to develop, which is to positively influence our human experience and condition. This positive experience is to refine who we are character-wise, to the point where we're no longer needing to rely on the stimulants of traditional religion or of what we perceive religion to be. We're no longer relying on those stimulants, but by the knowledge that we've gained through experience, we now have a memory sewn into our being, engraved into our heart, to live by. To not simply live by, but to gain further experience of, for refinement, for reflection, for perfection. So perfecting and reforming personal religion. We are perfecting our devotional mind by reforming from what is contrary to the health of our devotional mind. And this chapter introduces that thought to us, because it's very reflective. It comes down to what do we really want? Do we really want a connection with the living God? Do we really care to know what is valid? Not necessarily in those words, but in the experience of those words. Or are we going to let traditional language get in the way of that, either causing us to hate what is in that book, or to dictate to us an experience relaying its opinion of what is in that book? The words matter, and that's the point of this first chapter. The words within the Bible matter, and the words within the Bible matter because we matter. We have brains and we have minds for a reason. As Paul said to the Corinthians, why is my mind judged by the conscience of another man? Because he was trying to get these ministers to understand that the experience is individual, the experience is personal, and it can only move forward by you embracing the task of letting those words read who you are. That's what makes these words living. I cannot tell any other book that is living as is the words that are in this book. And they're living in the sense of edifying. And they're edifying in the sense of a revelation that is personal and that leads to a continual reforming in life, in love, in industry, in want, in need, in desire, in everything. That's why this chapter, even though brief, practical living through self-regulation, fits